Hi, MOS 4472 team. In this video, I am going to take you through chapter 14, which looks at information systems and controls. So in chapter 2, we talked about risk. In chapter 3, we discussed internal controls and how they're used to diffuse or mitigate some of the risks. And in this chapter, we're going to look at risks in particularly to information control systems. So let me share my screen with you and let's get started. Let's do the display settings. So chapter 14 looks like at information systems and controls. In this chapter, we're going to look at how we decide on who can access systems, how organizations physically protect systems, how do organizations keep systems running in case of emergencies, and how changes are made to systems. So by the end, we're going to be able to describe the COBIT framework and its 5 domains, evaluate logical user access controls, explain how physical access controls protect equipment and systems. We're going to compare backup and recovery efforts and summarize the change management process. So let's start with COBIT. In chapter 3, we looked at COSO from the perspective of Sarbanes-Oxley and how COSO helps to provide controls. COBIT is similar to COSO in that it is a framework, but COBIT looks at IT systems in particular, not controls in general. Framework to mitigate risk. IT governance is the process that ensures effective and efficient use of IT so a company can achieve its goals and provide values. To implement best IT governance practices, companies turn to frameworks. IT governance frameworks define the criteria a company can use to implement, manage, and monitor IT governance, including measurements for effectively leveraging IT resources. So as I mentioned, COBIT specifically looks at IT system governance and how that is done. Introducing COBIT. COBIT was developed by the Information System Audit and Control Association, the ISACA. Don't worry about knowing that name. And its name originally stood for Control Objective for Information and Related Technology. COBIT is the most widely used international standard for IT governance. The most recent version, COBIT-19, is designed to help companies meet regulatory compliance requirements, manage IT risk, and ensure that IT strategies are aligned with corporate goals. So the main focus is on IT and making sure that the systems are managed in such a way that risks are mitigated and the IT systems align with the corporate strategy and purposes. So COSO versus COBIT, here's a comparison of the two frameworks. COSO internal controls and integrated framework and COSO ERM framework look at corporate governance, while COBIT 2019 in comparison looks just at IT governance. It looks at systems. It doesn't look at any other controls. The control scope of COSO is all internal controls, automated, manual, detective, corrective, preventative controls, whereas COBIT is only IT-specific controls. The audience for COSO is management, board of director, and internal and external audit. In contrast, COBIT is mostly used by IT managers, IT professionals, and internal and external audit. The 5 domains of COBIT. The 5 domains of COBIT 2019 are divided into 2 categories based on their objectives. One category is IT governance, which looks at creating the strategy. And the second category is management IT objectives, which looks at turning the strategy into action. So first we create a strategy and then we implement the strategy, or in the wording of this slide, turn the strategy into action. 5 COBIT domain and over 40 objectives. So the first is governance, is to evaluate, direct, and monitor. So when you're evaluating, directing, and monitoring, you're ensuring that the governance framework is set and maintained, ensuring the benefits of IT system delivery, ensuring that risk is realized, ensuring resource optimization, and ensuring stakeholder transparency. The next one is management, align, plan, and organize. So in this one, you're really managing data, you're managing risk, you're managing relationships. The third one is still part of management, but now you're building, acquiring, and implementing. So in this case, you're managing change, you're managing knowledge, you're managing assets, you're managing programs and projects. The fourth domain is delivery, service, and support, and you're managing operations, managing continuity, and managing security services. And the fifth one in management is monitor, evaluate, and assess. So here you're managing systems of internal control, you're managing assurance, you're managing performance and conformance monitoring. IT governance objectives are evaluate, direct, and monitor, or the EDM, is the only IT governance focused domain in COBIT 2019. This domain states that the board of directors or governing body of an organization must evaluate stakeholder needs and IT strategic operations, create direction by prioritizing and making decisions about those options, and monitoring these IT strategies for performance, progress, and compliance. So basically, the IT strategy needs to align with business strategy, and the board of directors are there to make sure that this is truly being done and that the IT system and organization meets all the stakeholders' needs and provides the necessary information needed to make effective and efficient decisions. So management objectives, one of them is to plan, align, and organize, or align, plan, and organize. And this addresses the way IT is used to meet organizational objectives. Then we have the build, acquire, and implement objective. And this is where management assesses IT requirements, acquires technology, and implements the technology. So as the name says, you build, acquire, implement. So it's all about getting technology ready for use. Then you have the deliver, service, and support. And this relates to the operational side of IT projects, including IT support. So you always need, once you build the system, you need individuals who can help users maintain and use the system. And then monitor, evaluate, and assess focuses on existing IT projects and whether they're meeting organizational objectives. So you're constantly evaluating the system in place and whether or not it meets the stakeholder needs, and you're making changes to align with the new business environment as it changes and progresses. Next objective is to evaluate logical user access controls. And we talked about access controls in class and the various categories of access controls, from administrator to read-only access. So logical and physical access controls. Logical access controls identify, authorize, or grant permission, authenticate or ensure that users are who they say they are, and provide access to users of a computer information system. Whereas physical access controls help a company keep track of who is going and coming to prevent unauthorized individuals from entering a facility. So a physical access control might be a swipe card, it might be a security person in front of the building. User access roles. Companies implement a type of authorization called role-based access control, or back to restrict network access by assigning individuals specific roles that have predefined criteria for what they can and cannot access in the system. User access roles are groups with predefined permission to which users are assigned, with each user assigned to only one role at a time. So a permission is a list of access rights or privileges a user has once assigned to a role. So for example, if my role is to be the human resource coordinator, I might have access to create new employees in the system, to modify the roles of the employees if they are transferred or moved departments or promoted, and then also to terminate employees. So the RBAC streamlines the logical access control process for IT personnel by eliminating the need to program access to every system for every employee. So rather than trying to figure out what employees are able to do, you create certain roles based on the hierarchy of the organization. You take an org structure and you figure out all the different jobs that there are, and based on the jobs, you assign employees to roles, and then the employee who has the job has that role and that certain configuration. The administrator role is the highest role in the hierarchy and has permission for all objects. So the administrator role is basically equivalent to a god. They're almighty and all powerful and can do all things. So in other words, people in this role not only have unlimited access themselves, they are also the ones who assign access roles to other users. Options for level of permission. So here's an example of something you might see in the system that an administrator can grant. So you have off, only specific people can access that site or module. Then you have a category where anyone can with the link can edit, or you can have a category where anyone with the link can add a comment, or anyone with a link can just view. So that'll be a read-only access. And here's the hierarchy of the different roles. You have administrator, which has all the privilege to all the objects. They can add, remove, and set access rights and privileges for all objects. We have a creator role that can create, use, and configure and delete certain things. We have a user who can just configure and use existing creations, but they're not able to delete or create new creations. And then the lowest role is a read-only role where you can just view the details of the data and the data itself, but you cannot perform any actions through the menus or toolbars. You can just read what's available. User authentication. User authentication is the process of associating the username of each authorized user with a unique identifier. Most companies assign employees with employee IDs. There are various kinds of identifiers, and they can be used individually or in combination for stronger control. Multi-factor authentication occurs when a strong combination of identifiers is required when a user logs in. As we discussed in class, many systems now require multi-factor authentication, so a password isn't enough anymore. Oftentimes you also get a prompt on your phone, and different students were talking about then using biometrics from the phone to access the system, or putting a certain code that you receive via email or text on your phone, or having an app where you can just authenticate that, yes, this is me, I'm the legitimate user, please let me access the site, I would like to. So here is a user authentication illustration. Something the user knows is the first step. So login ID, password, PIN. Then you can look at something the user has, like an ID, badge, a smart card, or a smart key. And then you have biometric authentication, and this is related to something that the user is. So it can be a voice print, a fingerprint, or a facial scan. User access provisioning. User access provisioning is the formal process of granting access to a new user. This process can be different from one company or another. So one thing you will notice as we talk about AIS, a lot of AIS information is organization specific. So every organization will have different systems and processes in place. User access provisioning illustration. So first you will have an access request, and this usually starts at an employee level when an employee requests access to the system through a service request system or a ticketing system. So you input a request to become a user. A ticket for the request is created. The ticket is sent to the IT department or the company's manager or director, depending how many approval processes are there. So the ticket is routed to the employee's manager and the system owner, who both review the request in the system request system and either approve or deny the ticket. If the ticket is approved, then access is granted, and the administrator grants access to the system and closes the access ticket. So you always will have a request, some kind of an approval process, followed by a decision of whether access is granted or denied. User access deprovisioning. User access deprovisioning is the formal process of changing a user's access. Organizations should keep an eye on the number of users they have in the system and the number of employees that have multiple user rights. It's really important from a risk management perspective to delete obsolete users, and if employees transfer jobs, it's important to delete their old user profile and create a new one. So here we have user access deprovisioning and illustration. In this case, we have two types of user access changes. One is due to termination and another one is due to an employee transfer. So if we have a termination, a list of terminated users is provided to the system administrator on a regular basis for removal, and then the system administrator removes all access. On the other hand, if you have a transfer request that's submitted through the service, it's going to go through much of the same process as a new user request. So you're going to need approvers to review the user's new job responsibility as well as current access and roles in the system and approve or deny the changes requested in the ticket. And then once, let's say, the ticket is approved, access is updated, the system administrator will remove the previous role and assign a new role to the updated permission level in the system, and they will close the ticket. It is amazing how often this isn't done correctly. Oftentimes employees will have a new role added, but sometimes they will still have the rights of the previous role. And when we discuss segregation of duties in the last chapter, we've discussed how this can be very troubling because the potential of fraud increases because a user might be able to bypass some of the segregation of duties that exist as controls. So there's two types of user access changes, as we saw in the last slide. With termination, upon notification of termination, all access for the user should be immediately revoked. It is rare to require further approvals, as removing someone's access does not create a risk for the company. The risk is keeping someone access and providing that person with continual ability to access the system. And then we have a transfer. So if an employee's status in the company changes, such as transferring to a different department or their current job changing in its scope of responsibilities, it is important to perform an analysis of the employee's current access and to assess whether the access is still appropriate in the role. This lowers the risk of lack of segregation of duties. For example, suppose you were in the accounting department and had creator level access to the general ledger, but decided to move a new position in internal audit. Your general ledger access would go from creator to read only to prevent a violation of segregation of duties, because internal auditors shouldn't have access that allows them to make changes in the general ledger system. Reviewing existing users. Dormant access exists when a user has not accessed the system for a significant period of time, but still has an active role that grants them access. User access reviews are periodic reviews of all current users and their system roles. This internal control protects the data and security of the system by lowering a variety of inappropriate use of risk. So you always have to perform reviews of system access, make sure that all terminated users are deleted, and maybe dormant access is suspended in the event that the employees have left the company or are on leave. So user access internal controls. Unauthorized access to a company's system or data may result in employee fraud, malicious attacks on system and data, systems and data being held for ransom, or data breaches. Logical controls for system access are essential to an effective internal control environment. So here's a summary of risks and controls in logical security. Our risk statement here is an unauthorized user gaining access to the company's systems or data may result in a variety of damaging consequences, such as fraud, malicious attacks, or data breaches. And here are some sample control activities that can prevent this. One of them is having policies and procedures for user access that are clearly documented and authorized. And this is done by the information security manager. Another thing that can be done is access to the system is granted to each user based on the user's business needs. And this is done by the system owners. Another control of unauthorized access is users' access to system is periodically reviewed for appropriateness. Inappropriate access is immediately revoked. And this is done by the system owner, so you can prevent fraud by having these controls. The next thing is an unauthorized user gaining access to the company's system or data may result in a variety of damaging consequences, such as fraud, malicious attack, and data breaches. And I think this is the same as the last slide. Yep. So we're just looking at more controls then. So another control that can be used is that users are prohibited from saving information on flash drives or portable hard drives and cannot email sensitive information outside the company's network. This will prevent fraud or attacks because nobody can remove data or bring in appropriate information. Another control activity that can prevent fraud or malicious attacks is roles and responsibilities and access privileges are designed to create proper segregation of duties needed to support business process objectives. So you don't have one or two users with supreme power where they can manipulate data to their needs. More internal controls that can prevent this from happening are new access requests are reviewed and approved before being granted. Also, access for transferred or terminated employees revoked in a timely manner. So you don't keep employees with access for longer than necessary. Okay, now we're going to talk about how physical access controls protect equipment and systems. So we're going to talk about where we actually locate our IT facilities and servers and the steps organizations can take to mitigate risk and prevent damage to their systems. So the data center, a company uses a data center to protect the physical components on which system and data are stored. Also known as a network operations center, A data center is an area in a building or even an entire building that is dedicated to the physical storage of computer and telecommunication systems. Data centers can be either on-site at the organization's headquarters or off-site at another facility. Data centers are very, very important because we see more and more organizations utilizing computerized systems. For example, when we go to our retail store, all their checkouts are connected to a data server, and all that information is flowing into a data center. 3 key environments of data center. You have to look at the outside environment, so the external environment that the data center is located. So for example, the location of the center, where geographically you would place a data center. You have to look at the inside environment, so like the room or the building the data center is in, and then the physical security around the data center and who has access. So the outside environment, the data center is the heart of a business. It keeps the business alive by providing connectivity across all business functions and maintaining operations. Data centers should be near the bottom floors of its physical building, and an ideal building will be on higher ground to avoid flooding. So you have to look at all these external components of the environment when you're assessing where to put your data center. So here is an example, and we see the data center is in the basement, and it's not right next to the operations center, and the operations center is basically the space that employees who monitor the data center work at. The inside environment, most data centers have their own air conditioning units, and the rooms are chilled to prevent overheating, because remember, a lot of power equipment gets hot. Conditions of the inside environment are monitored at all times through the operations center. The operations center is where data center employees ensure that things are operating properly. Employees also maintain and update an inventory of the equipment, systems, and data within the data center, and this environment is kept in the operations center. Sorry, inventory, not environment. So here is an example of the inside environment. So the data center has raised floors to help against flooding. There's servers, there's air conditioning in the data center to avoid machine overheating and the possibility of a fire. You have an emergency door that employees can leave out of, but it has a doorknob only on the inside, so people can't sneak into the data center. And then you have fire suppression equipment, so in the event that there is a fire, it can be put out quickly. You also usually have an uninterrupted power supply in the data center, so a backup generator or multiple backup generators in case the electricity goes down. You want to make sure that your data center is saving information and is operating rather than being offline. And then you have your operations center room where employees that look after or monitor the data center work. Physical security, not everyone can enter the data center. This is the center of a company's IT infrastructure, and unauthorized access to this room is a high risk to the equipment that is powering the business. Only employees directly involved with operating the data center are authorized to enter. You don't want anyone to come into the data center who isn't authorized, because they can do a lot of damage to an organization by destroying the whole or part of a data center. Physical access internal controls. Robust IT governance process ensures all physical computer systems and data equipment are protected. Common risks to physical equipment and systems include a natural disaster causing damage to systems and equipment may result in disruption of business activities and financial losses. Also, an unauthorized user gaining access to physical equipment may result in theft, malicious attacks, frauds, or data breaches. And failure to maintain facilities in accordance with laws and regulations may result in fines and reputational losses. So here is a summary of the risk and controls in physical centers. So our risk statement is these control activities apply to all potential risks in the business process. So policies and procedures for maintaining physical equipment are clearly documented and authorized. Then we have physical equipment is subject to clear accounting and inventory management practices. Our other risk statement is natural disaster causing damages to systems and equipment may result in disruption of business activities and financial losses. And our control activity is specialized equipment and devices are installed to monitor and control the environment of the data center. Then we have natural disaster causing damages to system and equipment may result in disruption of business activities and financial losses. So IT equipment is stored in a location that minimizes and mitigates susceptibility to environmental threats such as air, fire, smoke, and water. And we discussed about having fire suppression equipment. So you would have fire extinguishers, there might be sprinkler systems just to ensure that a fire doesn't break out and damage the equipment. Eating and drinking are prohibited where IT equipment is stored to avoid spillage and damage of the equipment. And then detection services such as fire alarms are regularly monitored and maintained to ensure that in the event of the fire, it is quickly detected and firefighters can come to fight the fire. Now we're going to talk about an unauthorized user gaining access to physical equipment may result in theft, malicious attack, fraud, and data breaches. Some control activities to prevent or mitigate this are access to premises, buildings, and areas is justified, authorized, logged, and monitored. So you understand who's coming into the building. You have a sign-in sheet and sign-out sheet. So you know when they come, when they leave. There should be special security cards or biometrics that those people need to go through to enter. Physical access to IT equipment is granted to each user based on business needs. So only those people who are required to get into a data center have access to it. Physical access to IT equipment, including access level and authorization of receiving access, is clearly documented. So you know who has access, and there is a process and place of granting access, so the appropriate approvals are provided. Then physical access to IT equipment is periodically reviewed for appropriateness. Inappropriate access is immediately revoked. So you review a list of individuals who have access and make sure that they should have access. And those who transfer or move jobs, you have to make sure that you revoke their access. Another thing you can do is users entering rooms where IT equipment is held are required to scan a badge or a fingerprint to gain access. So once again, you're controlling who's coming in and out. And then the last risk statement is failure to maintain facilities in accordance with laws and regulations may result in fines and reputational losses. So facilities are managed in line with regulation, health, and safety guidelines. So basically the business is following the law on how they maintain their facilities. Next, let's talk about backup and recovery efforts. Most businesses need to engage in business continuity planning, so basically disaster planning. A business continuity plan is a set of procedures that a business undertakes to protect employees, other stakeholders, and assets in the event of a disruptive event. It ensures that a business and all its processes continue running. It is always evolving, and companies use lessons learned from previous events to improve their business continuity programs. So on a whole level, you have a business continuity program that is focused on keeping the business processes up and running. And a subset of the business continuity planning is your disaster recovery plan, which focuses only on keeping technology up and running. So the disaster recovery plan is a subcomponent of the business continuity planning. Disaster recovery planning. Companies categorize systems and data based on importance. The importance of an organization's data determines the location, quality, and frequency of backups. Companies use the level of importance to determine three key considerations. The backup site, so where to locate the backup data, the backup strategy, so the quantity of data that you're backing up, and the backup cycle is how often are you backing up the data or the frequency. A backup site is a physical location where companies' personnel will go to recover systems and data after a disaster. A backup site is a recreation of a data center and provides the company with a place of operations if the data center is impacted during a disaster. Backup sites can be hot, so fully operational, warm, semi-operational, or cold, basically non-operational. You have a room. In case something goes wrong, you have a room you can go to, but you don't have equipment in that room. The name relates to the amount of effort it will take to make the backup site operational in the event of a disaster. So a hot backup site, which is immediately operational after a disaster, is the most expensive to maintain. A hot backup site runs and backs up continuously. Data is continuously backed up on a second-by-second or minute-by-minute basis, making the hot backup site a ready-to-go center of data operations. A unique risk for hot backup sites is that a virus entering the life system is immediately backed up to the hot site. So there's no discrimination between the actual site and the hot backup site because they are being updated at the same time. It's basically just a replication of the current data center. A warm backup site. So a warm backup site is equipped with servers ready for systems to be installed and contains only some of the equipment needed to ramp up operations. It might take more than a couple of hours to switch over to a warm backup site, but the cost of maintaining it is significantly less than the cost of maintaining a hot backup site. So many companies opt to have a warm instead of a hot backup site simply because of the cost. So you have to look at the risk and see if it makes sense from a risk perspective to pay extra for a hot backup site or whether a warm backup site is sufficient. So when it comes to importing data backups, the data at a warm backup site may only be updated at the end of each day instead of real time. So there is a difference between the actual operating center than the backup site in a warm site. At the other extreme, we have a cold backup site. So a cold backup site is an almost empty room with no servers or equipment ready. It has physical space, power, climate control, and physical security controls, but it is otherwise unequipped. Data is not stored in a cold site because systems are not installed. Significant time must be spent installing equipment, systems, and data. Recovering to a cold backup site often takes days or weeks. So in a cold site, you don't have anything available. It will take a lot of work and effort to get things up and running. So here is a nice table summarizing hot, warm, and cold site based on the cost, the backup speed, and recovery time. So a hot site is the most expensive. but its backup is continuous, and you have the fastest recovery in case of a negative unforeseen event. With a warm site, the cost is medium. The backup depends on what kind of data backup cycle the organization's using, and the recovery speed is medium. And then the most inexpensive site is the cold site, but you'll have the slowest recovery time, and the data backup is probably much slower, and you don't have the most current information saved. So there's two concepts that are closely connected, but slightly different. We have something called recovery time and another something called recovery point. When a disaster strikes, businesses focuses on two metrics: recovery time objective, which is how much time a system can be down before it causes significant damage to the business. And then we have a recovery point objective, which is how much data can be lost before it causes significant damage to the system. So both the time and point look at the damage to the business. Time looks at how long can a system be down, whereas the point looks at how much data can be lost. So they're closely related, but they're slightly different. So please be aware of the differences. So here's the difference between recovery point and time illustrated with a visual. So recovery point looks at how much time since the last backup, and recovery time looks at how much time will it take for operations to resume. Now we're going to talk about different data backup strategies. So a backup strategy determines which data is being stored during a data backup. And there are three basic types of backup strategies. We have full, we have differential, and we have incremental. So full backups involve copying all existing data in its entirety every time. So you're basically replicating everything that is created from the beginning of the business to the current day. And then if you're doing a backup the next day, once again, from the beginning of the organization up to current day. So you're storing a huge amount of data. This is the slowest of the backup strategies and requires a lot of storage, as it means creating a full copy of your data every day. And here is an example of the full backup illustration. You're constantly creating new copies of everything. In comparison, you can do something called a differential backup. And differential backups involve copying all data created since the most recent full backup every time. So every so often you'll do a full backup, but then you'll do these incremental backups. Differential backups are the middle ground of backup strategies. They take a moderate amount of time and storage space. So here's an example of the moderate backup. You have your full backup that occurred. After the full backup, you just back up the current day, which is Monday. The next day, you will back up Monday and Tuesday. On Wednesday, you will back up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. On Thursday, you will back up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then on Friday, you do all 5 days of the week. If you were going to run a full backup, let's say on Saturday, then you do the backup from the beginning of the company to Saturday. And then you would start again, let's say Sunday, if that's your schedule. Now let's talk about incremental backups. Incremental backups involve copying only new or updated data with each backup. This is the cheapest strategy and it uses the least amount of storage. So as you can see here, you do a full backup and then every day after you're just copying that day's data. You're not thinking about the day before. On Monday, you just do Monday's data. On Tuesday, you just back up Tuesday's data. On Wednesday, just Wednesday's data. On Thursday, just Thursday's data. And on Friday, just Friday's data. Here is a table summarizing what we talked about and the difference between these strategies based on the data backed up, the backup time, and the amount of storage necessary. Now we're going to talk about backup cycles. A backup cycle determines when data is being stored during a data backup. This is the frequency with which data is backed up. All three data strategies can be implemented using various backup cycles. Backup cycles are important when planning for your recovery plan. So one of the backup strategies that is most common is called the grandfather, father, son redundant backup. As I mentioned, this is one of the most common backup cycles. This scheme is used to 3 backup cycles. You have a monthly backup, a weekly backup, and a daily backup. The grandfather cycle or the monthly backup will occur once a month, and it's a full backup from the beginning to the end of time. The father cycle is a full backup as well, but it occurs only once a week. And then you have your son cycle, which is either an incremental or differential backup that occurs every day. So here is a calendar with an example. So at the end of the month, you see the grandfather backup happening. Every day you have the son backup, except on Sunday, which you have your full father, and then you have your full father backup occurring before the end of the month, and it always comes before the grandfather. So you'll have the father the day before and the grandfather the day after. Data storage internal controls. Disruptive events may result in interruption of business operations, the primary data center becoming inoperable, or the loss of company data. Business plans for data loss and mitigate the risk by implementing internal controls such as the business continuity planning, backup sites for the data center, and regularly scheduled backup cycles for data. So by using these strategies, a business mitigates the risk of actually losing data or losing your operation site. So here is our risk statement. A disruptive event may result in the interruption of business operations and systems. And the way we control this is with a business continuity plan being developed and maintained based on the strategy and objectives of the company. You can also have all concerned internal and external parties provided with regular training regarding the business continuity procedures and their roles and responsibilities in case of an event. By training employees of what to do and what they're responsible for, they're able to react right away in case of an emergency. Then you would have a separate disaster recovery plan that is developed and maintained based on the company strategy and objectives. So this is your IT specific plan of what happens in the event of disaster to our IT equipment. The other control event that can be done is the business continuity plan is reviewed periodically to ensure that it's up to date and reflects the current business requirements. For example, if you're in a rapidly changing industry, you need to look at your business continuity plan to make sure that the current plan actually addresses the operating reality of the business. This is especially important if a business is growing or deteriorating, so that employees know what to do. And then we have the disaster recovery plan includes considerations for alternative equipment sites to either have a hot site, warm site, cold site to ensure operational continuity. So you always have to think about what will happen if our headquarters crumble in an earthquake or get destroyed by a hurricane. And it's always good to have alternate sites for employees to go to continue serving their customers and their market. Here's the risk statement is a disruptive event may result in loss of data stored on primary servers. So businesses mitigate the risk of this by the availability of critical data managed to ensure operational continuity. So backup sites and backup data. Data backup strategies and cycles are implemented to meet the needs of the business's objective. So depending on the type of business, you need to think about how often is the data being backed up. Lastly, we're just going to talk about change management in general. So changing from manual to automated processes would require a change management procedure. And we're seeing this more and more in business, especially in accounting. A lot of audits were performed manually. Now, a lot of AI is used to do those primary audit tasks that were previously done by junior auditors. And this is helpful for companies from a risk perspective because humans take much longer to review things. So they weren't able to review every transaction. A sample was taken and a sample was audited, whereas with AI, you can audit every transaction. There's no longer, sampling's no longer required. So the change management process, change management is a standardized process that decreases risk by controlling the identification and implementation of required changes to a system. Updates to a system can have a significant impact on its users. Changes must be made quickly and reliably, and they need to be reviewed appropriately before they are finalized. 3 stages to the change management process. A formal change management process consists of 3 stages that changes to a system code must pass through. These stages occur in isolated environments that enforce segregation of duties for each of the 3 steps of the change management process. Please remember that this is the change management process under regular conditions. If there's an emergency, the change management process looks a little bit differently. But if you're doing just normal plan changes, this is what the process looks like. So the first step is to create change in a test environment. So you have your IT person creating new code. The second stage is evaluating the accuracy of changes in a model environment. So once the coder writes the code, let's say they bring in an accountant to test the new module or application to make sure it does what it's supposed to do. And then once the accountant approves the change and says, yes, I can write these journal entries very easily, then you will implement the changes in the production environment. So here is an example of a change management process. You go from the test environment to the model environment and the production environment. And the textbook compares it to you writing a paper. At first, you do an initial draft. Then you will compile the initial draft and change it until you have a master draft. And then you will turn that master draft into a final paper with some edits and changes. Test environment. The test environment is often called a sandbox because developers can play here without having any impact on the actual system and the way code is created. Usually a user submits a request ticket for a new function. The developer writes the code and the code is routed to the model environment. The model environment is a recent copy of the live system, which is used to implement the code in an environment that looks almost like production and has the person requesting the code testing it. So the code creates model system for testing. You have your requester or user that approves the changes after they're testing it. Then it goes for another stage of approval by the IT analyst who approves and documents testing. And finally, you route the code to the production environment. The production environment is the final stage during which the updated system goes live and is available to end users. So then you need to implement the code into the actual system. So code is saved in the production environment, production control implement the code, code is live, and then the ticket is closed. So here is the 3 stages, and we have what happens in each stage, who has access to each stage, and what are the outputs. So in the test environment, you have the developer writing the code that the user has requested. In this stage, only the developer has access to the code, and their main responsibility is creating the code. Whereas in the model stage, you have the user reviewing the outcome of the code when it runs in a model environment. If the outcome is accurate, the user approves the change. The IT analyst tests the functionality of the code and authorizes it, and they document their testing. And in this case, you have the business user who requested the code having access to the new system, and the IT analyst, and the outputs of this process are user approval, IT approval, and documentation of the testing. The last stage is the production. So in this stage, the production control employee implements the code into production. This employee cannot change the code to ensure that only the code that was tested and approved by IT and the users implemented in the system. At this stage, production and control employees have access, and the output is basically the code gets put into the live system and it becomes updated. Normal versus emergency changes. Normal changes follow the formal change management process to avoid the risk of mistakes, whereas your emergency changes require immediate actions to mitigate a significant risk, such as a system outage or compliance issue or a security issue. So here's a full cycle of an emergency change. If an emergency change happens, you have the user submitting a ticket, the developer writes code, but you no longer go into a model environment. You go straight to the production environment and you save the code and implement it there, and the code goes live. And once the code is live, you have the IT analyst as business owner approve the changes and document testing after the code has been implemented for 24 or 48 hours. So you are testing and approving the code in a live environment versus a model environment. So that's the main difference. There's no model environment when emergency changes are concerned. Change management internal controls. Unauthorized or incorrectly executed changes to a system may result in incompatibility with existing infrastructure. You might have disruption in ongoing business processes due to system malfunctions or outages. There could be data breaches or malicious code being programmed into the system. Or you might have internal fraud, which occurs when an employee steals from the business. So here is the risk statement, and there's the internal controls. So the risk is unauthorized or incorrectly executed changes to a system may result in infrastructure issues, business disruptions, malicious attacks, or internal fraud. And the control activities that an organization can take is change requests are evaluated, prioritized, and authorized to determine the impact on business processes and IT services. Then you can have changes are logged, prioritized, categorized, and authorized and scheduled. You might have a secure test environment defined and established that mirrors the actual environment of the business to make sure that the requests aren't some type of a hack or a malicious attack. And then you might have users acceptance testing independently, verifies that changes meet the defined test plan before the changes migrate to the live environment. So you're testing the code in a model environment to ensure that it is correct and what your user actually wants and requested. Other controls that you can take is complete change are formally documented to indicate the changes made and the procedures affected by the changes. So you have clear documentations and an audit trail. You can have a tracking and reporting system that documents which changes are rejected, approved, in process, and completed. When it comes to emergency changes, they're managed and authorized using formal procedure that minimizes further incidents. And then you can look at a post-implementation review test that tests the outcomes of the changes to ensure that new or changed services meet the planned performance and outcome. So even if you do go live with an emergency change, you should test it afterwards to make sure that it's working correctly. And that is it. I hope you found this presentation helpful. I look forward to seeing you in class. Have a lovely day and take care. And if you have any questions, please email me. Bye, everyone.